Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everybody. How's it going?
Good.
All
Good, good, good.
right. Welcome and welcome to life after the fall holidays. I hope everybody enjoy them in whatever way you may have experienced them. And what we're going to do is um, one more session about Shabbat. And I wanted to touch upon a little bit about what I wanted to touch a little bit about what we began to talk about last time, which was about what it means to uphold the spirit of Shabbat, specifically as it relates to a very modern issue, which is electricity. And we're going to get a little bit into the weeds of this because this is a prime example of how conservative rabbis, the conservative movement in general, approach Jewish law that is, I think, unique, um, in some ways at least, among the major movements of Judaism. And it will relate back, at least somewhat, to our very first session, our initial session, all about um, what makes this stream of Judaism unique and a little bit different than some of the others. So, again, partially we're going to be talking about sort of a big macro question. And in another way, we're going to be talking about very micro issues. And so I hope you're willing to be along for the ride. Obviously, feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Okay. So we talked last time about a number of prohibitions when it comes to Shabbat. Um, as a hopefully a reasonable reminder to the overall idea, it was very unclear for the most part why or what exactly it meant to not work on Shabbat. That work does not necessarily refer to exertion or physical exertion. It may involve a lot of different things, and the rabbis went to, for the most part, define certain categories that had to do with things that had to be done in order to build the Mishkan, which is the portable sanctuary first described in the book of Exodus. In other words, if it involved building the Mishkan, then it was involved um, in general. Like, in other words, if it was involved in building the Mishkan, it was therefore a category of work you couldn't do on Shabbat. So that led to a bunch of different challenges. So when it comes to a matter of electricity, did I tell the story last week of the man in Chicago and the elevator?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so let me tell you this story. Okay, so a there are many who keep Shabbat strictly, who define the prohibition against lighting a fire on Shabbat. They interpret it as, among other things, a prohibition against turning a light on or off, or operating anything that would cause a light to turn on and off, any kind of electric item. So there's a story I heard about an older man who lived in Chicago and lived in an apartment, I think on the 20th floor of this building. And he kept Shabbat very strictly. And so one challenge he had was, okay, he didn't want to press the button of the floor that he had to go to on the elevator on Shabbat. But his understanding of Jewish law was that if you there's no prohibition on going on something that is moving if it is already moving based on something you didn't do. Meaning, if somebody else pushed a button and you happen to be in the elevator, you could go as far as the elevator took you, right? However, you're not supposed to ask the person directly to push the floor you want to go to, because then you might as well be doing it yourself. Okay. This is a very common way of looking at how to handle the matter of electricity on Shabbat among observant Jews. So this man, this one particular time, on a Shabbat afternoon, he's come back from synagogue. He goes toward the elevator, and what he would normally do in this circumstance, so that he didn't have to walk up 20 flights of stairs, would be whoever was going on the elevator, he would just go to the highest floor that they went to, or the closest floor he did to floor 20, and then walk the rest of the way. And the thinking was, okay, if they went up to floor 14, all right, at least I only have to walk up 6 flights of stairs instead of 20. Fair enough, right? So this one particular time, he is approaching the elevator, and the only other person in the elevator is a young woman. They the uh, the the doors close. She presses the floor she wants to go to, and she looks at him and says, "What floor?" So I can, push the button. And he said, "Wherever you're going," which she interpreted as he was going to follow her and stalk her, and she apparently like elbowed her, elbowed him because she thought he was getting fresh with him, and he's like, "No, no, no, I'm not trying to do anything." So that's one story about this. Okay, now here's another practical story about this sort of thing. There are those who say that if you don't want to operate electricity, you certainly can't cause somebody else who's Jewish to use electricity, because you'd be causing them to break Shabbat. The thinking goes. However, there are some schools of thought that say, well, if you can, um, that if you ask, or if somebody who is not Jewish uses the electricity, well, they're not responsible for the commandment, so therefore it's okay to if they operate the electricity. However, again, you're not supposed to ask them, right? Because then you might as well be doing it yourself. So the method that I remember learning growing up is that if, let's say, you're in a room and the air conditioning was turned off and you really need the air conditioning on, and you see somebody who isn't Jewish, maybe say, you have them come into your room and say, it's really stuffy in here. It's really stuffy in here, in the hopes that they'll go, oh, well, let me fuss with the thermostat, and, we can, that's the idea, right? You're not supposed to ask them, but you can hint at them. Okay. So there's this one story of a man who was working, a Jewish man. He's working for a synagogue, and it's Saturday afternoon, and he needs to get something out of the storeroom at the synagogue, out of the storage room. And he needs to find it. The lights are off. So what does he do? He finds this young person who just had joined the janitorial staff, brings him over, and says, "Hey, don't you think it's really dark in here?" The person says, Yeah. I mean, it's really dark in here. It is. This poor kid doesn't know what's going on. I mean, it's really dark in here. And finally, the kid kind of gets the hint and turns on the light. So when Shabbat ended, after Shabbat ended, the this man goes up to the person on the janitorial staff and says, "Look, I'm sorry. I know that was really weird. I didn't mean to be so mysterious about that." And he explained the rule and everything like that. And the kid said, "Oh, okay, yeah, no, it's fine. I think I remember learning about that in Hebrew school." Oops. So now you're dealing with very, particulars of the law, right? And it is reasonable to ask, why are people going to such a large extent, to avoid using electricity? Why are people going to so many different um, uh, extremes, it might seem? So, what I want to do is I want to lead this into a question that rabbis of the conservative movement dealt with a number of years ago that had to do with electricity. In other words, are we really sure that the use of electric items is the same as lighting a fire? Right? Lighting a fire on Shabbat, by the way. Again, that is in the Torah. You're not supposed to do this. Exodus chapter 35, verse, I think 3, either 2 or 3. It says you should not light a fire on Shabbat. That's very few times where it says in the Torah exactly what you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. That is one of those times. So, in other words, people take it seriously. Well, think for a moment, the implications of this. The implications are very vast, at least in the modern world we live in. When there are so many items that we rely on a regular basis that involve the use of electricity. How can we justify using it? Can we ever justify using it? And so that question was brought up. And I think it's best for me just to introduce this article and kind of go through different things. And there's going to be a table at the end that will give their interpretation of what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. So let me share my screen. Give me a moment. Okay. So let's go to the front of this. Okay. This is the use of electrical and electronic devices on Shabbat. Okay. And by the way, this, you see this every time there is a meeting of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. There's a vote taken on whether this understanding of Jewish law is considered appropriate. And as you can see, um, this passed by an overwhelming majority, 17 to 2 opposed, 2 abstaining. That's a very convincing vote. Um, and by the way, that doesn't mean that every conservative rabbi has to abide by these exact rules. If they want to be stricter, that's fine. However, this is an idea. So, um, the question that is posed: may electrical appliances and electronic devices be used on Shabbat? If not, then why not? If so, then with what restrictions? What other halachic values, what other Jewish values should be considered regarding the use of electricity on Shabbat? And May some restrictions on the use of electricity be waived in favor of the needs of disabled or frail individuals? Okay. I recognize that, this is, I mean, this class is obviously called Judaism 101. And um, I recognize that perhaps I may be getting into weeds that may be a little too thick. And I don't mean to do so. If I am jumping ahead of things, of ideas or what have you, if I'm making certain assumptions of people's foreknowledge, please stop me and I can back up. So I don't, I'm not trying to make assumptions about your abilities to understand. I just want to make sure that I'm meeting you at the right place. So, okay. So it begins with the flick of a switch. This action, so effortless and casual, is nonetheless a powerful marker of modernity. The switch completes or breaks a circuit, unleashing or suspending the flow of electrons which power every conceivable type of machine. With electricity, we control our physical environment, altering the shape and structure of objects and yielding light and dark, heat and cool, sound and silence, and innumerable other environmental adaptations. Okay. I'm not going to be reading every word of this. This would take way too long and would get far too much into the weeds, but I wanted to kind of, give this idea. Um, okay. Jumping to this. Using electricity makes us powerful, yet there is a cost to being permanently networked. Our digital servants have the tendency to become tyrants, and it is nearly impossible to escape their reach. Going down a little farther. Simple pleasures, such as sitting with family and friends over an undisturbed meal, reading in a quiet room, and taking a leisurely stroll, have become rare in our culture. We need a break, and Shabbat is here to help us, even as it helped earlier generations rest from the physically intensive tasks that typified their work. Okay, so what he is talking about, at least to my mind, has to do with, he hasn't touched on Jewish law yet. He's talking about the spirit of Shabbat. This idea that whether or not you're getting into the nitty gritty of what constitutes work and what doesn't constitute work, this overall idea of taking a break from the other 6 days of the week, he's making the case that electricity can and sometimes does make that either impossible or very difficult. Okay, he is obviously going to get into this, right? Um, as we will see, Shabbat fosters a different state of consciousness through its detailed regulation of human behavior. Each action is analyzed through two lenses. Okay, this is where we're getting into the matter of the spirit of Shabbat and the letter of the law of Shabbat. Is it milacha, meaning the type of work prohibited by halacha, by Jewish law? And does it undermine shavut, the positive obligation to rest on Shabbat? So there, I think he's defined better than I have. I think these dueling ideas, right? We're not we're not supposed to work on Shabbat, and we are supposed to rest on Shabbat, right? We're supposed to do those two things. There's the negative and there's the positive. This is why I was talking about the idea of saying yes and saying no. Um, and so electricity is really a topic to really examine this. Okay. I know I've done a lot of talking. Does anybody have any questions at the moment?
I kind of think out loud, so maybe it's a question, maybe it's me talking.
Give it a try. Give it
I'm,
a try.
I'm I'm trying to like I just read Exodus 35, 1 to 3, and it really seems like it's a focus on work not working. So I wonder if the fire is just a connection to working, like saying don't be cooking, don't be doing extra work on Shabbat. What do you think about that?
So are you asking whether the prohibition against lighting a fire is should be really understood as metaphor, like as sort of like a broader idea, like or more metaphorical?
Maybe like if I had servants, and God wants them to also rest, I might, if I didn't have this law, might say, oh, they can cook my dinner or whatever, or my wife or something like that, and I would be making them work by having a fire. Or I, I guess I'm not sure how to get where I'm going, what I'm thinking about, but is it to me, I'm not sure the electricity thing. Like I understand what you're saying about the commandment to rest and then the commandment to not work. Because that to me that covers like me driving a short distance as long as it's not stressful or whatever on Shabbat. But I guess I'm trying to think more about it. I don't even know
No,
how to
no,
form my question.
no, it's fine.
Uh,
And by no, and I mean it's good. It's good. And I, I mean I think that it's no, I mean you raise important ideas. And certainly the question is, shouldn't we all be resting on Shabbat? Everybody, whether or not you're obligated to be a part of the commandments, right? That can be one way of looking at it. And by the way, there are people who really don't like and really disapprove of the notion that we should be um, uh, hinting at those who are not Jewish to do things potentially for us. There are those who say that, that may be a bridge too far because, again, even if you're hinting, I mean, you can hint at anyone. So those are good questions. Because I think part of the idea is that we are we are supposed to avoid um, obligating somebody to do something that they are obligated not to do. Right. So that,
Rabbi,
yeah,
my question would be, in my house, I have a light in every room that runs through a smart plug,
sure.
and they automatically turn on at a certain hour and turn off at a certain hour. I
Hmm.
also have that computerized thermostat, for the heating and air. Is that considered work? I mean, they're set up, they do it every day, but I don't do anything to them. I've just set it up. Would that be considered work?
So I don't remember whether this paper goes into that specific question, but I what I can tell you is that there are many observant Jews who where in other words, in which if it is pre-programmed, if they have pre-programmed things to turn on or off at a certain time, if they have done all that pre-programming prior to the beginning of Shabbat, that there are many who say, okay, that's not work, right? I mean, even before the use of, smart devices, so-called smart devices, um, there, I mean, I mean, having timers on lights, I mean, those have been around for as long as I can remember. Maybe even before that, right? Having a little device that it's like, oh, it's 11 p.m. We're going to automatically shut off, we're going to automatically, turn off your lamp or something like that. That's been around for a while, even before it was computerized. So there are those who will who say that's okay. There are others who don't. So and I recognize that. Okay, maybe I'm not giving you a clear answer, but certainly, will you find a lot of people who would agree with you? Sure. That would, or would you find a lot of people who would say, "Oh, that's okay"? Yeah, absolutely would.
I think for
So
me, for coming from the outside, looking
yeah,
in, turning the lights on doesn't seem like work to me.
sure.
And to me, that's where it's like, is the fire itself work, or is it me working that is work? And I, when I read it and exit, it just seems like it's connected to the work part. It's connected to cooking or to burning whatever you might be burning on the Sabbath or on a normal day. But turning the lights on to me doesn't seem like work. It's something I do without thinking when I walk into a room. But
Sure.
I don't know. That's what I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But
No, it's entirely fair. And yeah, and there are those who make that that argument, right? There are those who will say that, look, I mean, uh, why are we making our lives that much more difficult by saying that? I think a flip side to that might be, and I'm not saying that this is what I necessarily believe or, what I'm trying to necessarily advocate, but I think a counter to that might be when you don't even have to think about whether to turn lights on or off. You don't even have to consider um that. It's like, in other words, you are letting creation, like, you're not impacting creation in one bit, is the idea. You are allowing the world to sort of go on autopilot for one day, as opposed to you impacting it. And yeah, flipping a switch is, in terms of exertion, it's pretty low. So,
What,
um,
what
yeah,
about like my friend's daughter who won't use the water cooler to get hot water? It's not the act of flipping the switch. I think her objection is that she's instigating the heating of the water,
right, right.
which is
So by the way, yeah, I mean, so by the way, I mean, like, and so let's get into this, right, a little bit, where it says, for many Shabbat observers, I'm gonna at the top of the screen, I think, the flick of an electrical switch is tantamount to the desecration of Shabbat. This is such a profound transgression that it may be considered a capital offense.
mm.
Although Judaism has not practiced the death penalty for 2 millennia. So, okay, hold me. So, before you think that anybody's putting anybody to death about this, no, 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 no. Uh, so now he goes on to say, maintaining a comprehensive ban on the operation of electrical and electronic devices on Shabbat is a policy with many advantages. It is relatively simple to explain and to enforce. Even a toddler can be trained to avoid operating electronics on Shabbat. All right, maybe they need a lot of reminders, but still, yeah. Forbidding even arguably permissible actions may be considered a siyag la Torah, meaning a fence around the Torah, preventing people from inadvertent performance of truly forbidden activities. So this is part of the argument about it. Like, so let's say like a smartphone, right? Okay, are you doing anything terrible by, like, like turning it on or off? Maybe not. But then what are you going to be doing on your smartphone? What sort of things are you doing? Are you going to be writing? Are you going to be conducting business? I mean, we use our smartphones for almost everything these days, right? So, in other words, you could say, by saying just don't even turn it on, don't even touch it. Maybe that's a little extreme, but the thought is you can potentially put that, by putting that fence around it, you are able to at least ensure that you're not going to do the things you really shouldn't do. Now, There are, however, exceptions, right? And this is part of what we're going to get into. Nevertheless, it says, other Shabbat observant Jews make distinctions between electrical appliances whose operation they find to be permitted and those which they deem prohibited. Such people claim that it is possible to avoid forbidden activities and to achieve the necessary state of tranquility on Shabbat, even while making limited use of electricity. In other words, like, isn't it possible in some ways that, like, by not being able to flip a switch, that you're making your life infinitely harder on Shabbat, right? So, for example, it says, dozens of Orthodox rabbis have endorsed a special light switch that is designed to avoid forbidden labor and is promoted under the slogan, control electricity on Shabbat, on Shabbos. The Zombet Institute in Israel has justified specially designed public telephones and computer keyboards to allow Shabbat observers to gain access to data without violating the laws of Shabbat. Now, some may shun the use of electricity unless it is indicated by another Jewish value, such as assisting people who are ill, frail, or disabled, performing necessary military services, avoiding great exertion and waste on Shabbat, or preventing animal suffering. Since many Shabbat observers leave unused appliances, such as lights, air conditioners, and elevators running all day, the refusal to adjust appliances according to need is not necessarily a green solution. In other words, if we're like, don't we care about preserving our environment, right? I mean, that's important too. Sometimes there are values that are in conflict. So that is why these are some of the reasons why these discussions are taking place. Now, what I want to jump to is to not necessarily do, the nitty gritty of oh, and yes, I will be happy to send out the this to everybody later, the whole paper, just so you can peruse it at your own discretion. What you should also, but let's also talk about the findings of this paper, right? Because if we went into all the nitty gritty, we'd be here forever. So let's talk about the findings, and we can talk about, and I'm not necessarily going to be able to answer why this was considered okay, this was not considered okay. But suffice it to say that this paper said that there are certain times where operating electricity is okay. There are other times where it isn't okay. So let me share that. Okay. Okay. So two things you need to to see. Okay. Now I recognize there's some Hebrew, and if you're not able to follow the Hebrew, let me give you a little bit of a quick rundown of what we're looking for. So I'm going to draw on this a little bit. Okay. So when it says asur, okay, this word here, asur means forbidden. Okay. And then if you see the word mutar or patur, those are two words having to do with permitted, or at least in some circumstances. Okay. So that's a sort of a key to that's maybe a key to some of this. Okay. So for instance, would they arrive at the idea of like a smartphone or a cell phone? It is not permitted. All right. It's not permitted because and by the way, and it should be noted, if I haven't already, that any observance of Shabbat, period, can be suspended in the case of an emergency. Okay, I don't know if I've mentioned that, but it's important to remember. If there is an emergency, if there is an immediate health concern, you can do any of these things, right? So please, I don't want it to be I don't want you to walk away thinking, oh my gosh, you know what, can I not call 911? Yes, if you have to call 911, call 911. Don't hesitate. Okay. So a cell phone, not allowed. A computer, not allowed. A digital camera or voice recorder, not allowed. An electric scooter or wheelchair is permitted in some cases for those who have no other way of walking. All right. Now, the other thing you see here is the difference here between Shabbat and Yom Tov. If you see that at the top of this picture, Shabbat meaning Friday night to Saturday, Yom Tov meaning a major holiday, which sometimes might fall on Shabbat and sometimes does not. An electric dishwasher, if it's Shabbat, you can. Or sorry, if Shabbat, you cannot use it. Sorry. If it is Yom Tov, that doesn't fall on Shabbat, you can potentially do put it on a timer. That is potentially allowed. Okay. An elevator. According to this, an elevator is permitted, meaning not only can you ride in an elevator, but you can press the button. Unlike this story of the person in Chicago, you can operate an elevator fully. And why? The comment says mishum tircha, which means because otherwise. What's a tircha? A tircha means essentially a pain in the neck, right? So this opinion essentially states, and pardon me while I turn on my car's engine so that I don't sweat like crazy. Sorry for the noise. Okay. So that is so an elevator you're allowed to use. An e-reader. And here's where I do kind of I do kind of depart from this a little bit. An e-reader meaning like a Kindle, right? Which is ironic given what we're talking about, kindling a flame. Haha, get it, right? An e-reader, they say it's allowed for vision disabled users in passive mode. In passive mode, meaning if it is like if you're not downloading anything, if you're not if you're not attached to the internet. So I would even go to say that you don't necessarily even have to be vision disabled. I don't think it's a problem to use it. My opinion, as long as you're not downloading the books on Shabbat. Okay. A fan, right? An air fan. You are allowed to use electricity to operate a fan. And I would think that applies to an air conditioner as well. You can deal with the thermostat. It's okay. Okay. A heating element, like a cook range, hair dryer, kettle, etc. You can't do that on Shabbat. If it is a Yom Tov, if it is a major holiday not on Shabbat, you are allowed. Right? The what is forbidden. So I mean, I think the idea is that, like, in other words, so you may be asking, all right, well, why could you operate a fan but not operate a a heater or something like that? And I guess one way to look at it is that, unless there is an urgent situation, you can always put a, you can always put a, throw on another blanket. You can always throw on another layer, at least in terms of your own personal comfort. Um, Inserting batteries, connecting power cords, no. The use of an intercom is fine. A lighting fixture is fine. And then you have a couple of different magnetic stripe cards. So one has to do with, like, if it's your, if it's a credit card, a debit card, or a fare card, like to go on a bus or whatever it is. On Shabbat and on Yom Tov, you're not supposed to do that. However, if it is a key card, you are allowed to. Meaning, if you need to press something electric in order to gain entry into a room or a building, you are allowed to do that. This becomes an issue many times in hotels. When was the last time you used a metal key to get into a hotel room? It's probably been a while, right? You're allowed to use that in order to gain entry to a room. A microwave oven, not allowed if it's Shabbat, but is allowed if it is a major holiday that doesn't fall on Shabbat. An MP3 player, a music player, you can use it. And an analog telephone, you can use it if you absolutely have to. What the note here is, it's ideal to avoid it, but it is permitted. It says "Choleh she'ein bo sakana," meaning if somebody's sick, even though there isn't immediate danger, right? So we already know that, if it's an emergency is an emergency, and you can do anything on this list if it's an emergency. But if you need to call somebody and say, hey, I can't make it to Shabbat dinner because I'm sick, you're allowed to do that. Okay. So those are some of the things that are allowed and not allowed according to this. Now, if you'll give me a moment, I feel like now I'm beginning to wonder whether this chart was cut off to some extent. So I want to make sure I'm not missing some of the charts. I feel like because alphabetically it stopped at M, so I'm like, did I miss some of this? So,
Can I ask you a question?
please go for it.
Uh, Most of the time I'm listening to you, it seems like you're just presenting this impartially, like it in structure or anything. You're not necessarily, I don't think you're necessarily advocating this as your viewpoint or the uh, conservative viewpoint, are you? This is just, I guess, a typical Orthodox viewpoint that we're looking at, or what?
This is a viewpoint by authorities within the conservative movement. Now, an important thing to remember about the conservative movement, though, is the idea that every rabbi is the Mara Da'atra, meaning the person who makes decisions for their community in terms of Jewish law. So, as I am the rabbi of Heska Amuna, I am the Mara Da'atra. I'm the one who can make decisions regarding Jewish law. That's part of the agreement, of doing so. That doesn't mean that everyone in the synagogue will always like what I have to will always like that. But so I try to build consensus if there's something that may be controversial or something like that. But in the end, I'm the one who has the say when it comes to matters of Jewish law for that community. So the purpose of these papers, and I think, maybe getting a little closer to what you're asking, Will, is the idea that this is sent out to conservative rabbis, conservative, the people who are the Mar d'Atra of their community, and they're saying essentially, this is a guide for you to follow. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow exactly. I would say that I'm a little more liberal than what's being presented here, personally.
Well, I
Yeah.
think I would think it's pretty obvious that the reform would be much more liberal in this, but is the Orthodox going to be much stricter than this?
I think there are. I think I don't want to speak for all Orthodox certainly, but I know that I would believe that most Orthodox would say that pretty much all of this is forbidden. Pretty much all of it is, according to I would say most Orthodox. Now, the writer of this paper acknowledged that there are a handful of Orthodox rabbis who've begun to push back against the complete and total blanket prohibition, but there's still very much a minority voice within the movement. So I want to talk about one other basic topic here, which is television. Television's a big topic. Is it such a problem to watch television on Shabbat? So how have some people gotten around it? Well, I mean, I know, like for instance, I know a family who kept Shabbat, and there was a big game on. There was a big game on TV, and that was going to start Saturday afternoon, and they just put the TV on to that channel on Friday night and just kept it on all night, all day, and watched the game. Was that okay according to the letter of Shabbat, the letter of the law? It was, or at least, yeah. I mean, I think you could say that it was. Was it in the spirit of Shabbat? It depends. And I think it's a question that I'm not necessarily going to give you the definitive answer for, but it's something to think about. There are many people for whom television is an important escape. It's an important bit of entertainment, especially as television has the quality of many television programs has gone way up in recent years. There are those who could understandably say, Shabbat is my only opportunity to watch football, to watch Netflix. The list goes on. It's my only opportunity to it. And it's an escape from the rest of the week. And isn't Shabbat supposed to be an escape from the rest of the week? It's a logical argument. And I don't necessarily disagree. The question becomes, at what point does the watching of TV become an ordinary thing? I don't think the threshold should be, well, okay, you're allowed to watch TV. If you never watch TV the rest of the week, you can watch it on Shabbat. I don't think that that's necessarily a realistic thing either. And by the way, watching TV, can be I mean, it is a passive activity, but in terms of how often are we at work and you have to watch a video for something? right? It's a pretty common thing. Like, the watching of videos is a very common thing, what have you. So the question becomes, is it okay for entertainment? All of that. Um, but I should also say that just because something is permitted by Jewish law doesn't mean that it's necessarily advisable. Let me give you an example. Technically, other than Passover, there is little to no things preventing me, according to Jewish law, from sitting at home for most, if not all the day, eating mint chocolate chip ice cream. Right? There is very little, if anything, preventing me, provided the ice cream is kosher, which it's not too hard to find kosher ice cream, provided that you say blessings before and after eating it. What's stopping me from having kosher ice cream for hours every day? And by the way, what a lovely thought, at least in theory, right? Okay. But does that mean that you should? Not hours every day. I think that's fair to say. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy my ice cream. I enjoy it very much. But, to eat it nonstop for days on end, but you could say, but I'm not going against Jewish law. But that doesn't mean you should. Right? So I kind of relate that to the question of television on Shabbat. Can you justify flipping a switch to watch TV? Yeah, probably. Does it mean you should? Well, here's the thing. Again, the spirit of Shabbat is something that it is an amorphous idea to an extent. What you consider to be in the spirit of something is something that at the end of the day, we all have to decide for ourselves what is spiritual, what is what moves our spirits. But when we talk about all the things, and this is the reason why I started with saying yes on Shabbat. When we think about all the things that Shabbat allows us to do, Shabbat dinner, Shabbat meals, synagogue, being a part of community, learning. Is that the best use of, would it be the best use of our time to spend every Shabbat binging on Netflix? Is that the best use of our, does that make does that fulfill one's spirit for Shabbat? When we think of all the other things we can do on Shabbat, that's beautiful. And that can fill our cup. I can't answer that for any individual. But I can tell you that as a rabbi of a synagogue, I'm not going to have a Friday night movie night at the synagogue. I'm not going to share videos on it. And I think it's understandable why I wouldn't. Because there are so many other things to say yes to, that upholding the spirit of Shabbat, to my mind, means, at least not as a Jewish communal activity, It's not something that I can endorse for a community. In your homes, maybe that's a different story. And I do not judge if you want to do that. But I do want to pose that as an idea. This was one that I gave you a lot of information, a lot of ideas. I have time for a quick question or two now. If you want to ask more, we can talk more about it next time. Next time, by the way, we're going to start talking about prayer, because I think prayer obviously, relates a lot to Shabbat. And although of course it has to do with the rest of the week as well. But I think it's a natural, jumping off point. But does anybody have a quick question or two right now that I can try to approach?
Yeah, I have
I've
a
got
question.
Oh, sure. I'm sure. Okay, go for it.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that in keeping Shabbat as a separate day, it should be radically different from the other 6 days of the week in how we live.
Mhm.
Is that
Radically different. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know to what extent I would say radically different, but different, absolutely. Um, you know, so so again, if so I mean, and I imagine you're asking about the TV, question, or at least that may be part of it, because yeah, I can totally see that. Right. I mean, like if you typically watch television on, a Tuesday or a Wednesday, then watching it on a Saturday does not feel radically different, right?
yeah?
I mean, this is an example.
But I guess what I'm asking, isn't the Sabbath, shouldn't the Sabbath be um very distinguishable from the other 6 days of the week?
I think that's a good goal. I think that is a good goal in general, to say, okay, we're going to uh like for instance, I mean, the example I gave, I think in one of the classes where if you have a piece of fish, if you find a piece of fish at the market on Monday, and it's like, oh, this is a nice piece of fish, this is a nice fish, I'm gonna save it for Shabbat. And then if you go to the market 2 days later and say, oh, I found an even better fish, you save that for Shabbat and you eat the one that you bought on Monday.
Mhm.
um, this doesn't take into account refrigeration issues or anything like that, but you get the idea, right? And that's what we're talking about. In other words, like there's something about saving your best for Shabbat.
Mhm.
Um, but I'll give you an example. One of the things that makes Shabbat distinguishable is it has to do with the clothes you wear. The idea is that on the synagogue you're supposed to wear nice clothes, and at Shabbat dinner in many cases we wear nice clothes, right? Um, and so I remember having a conversation with someone who said, I have to dress professionally for work every day. I have to wear a suit for work every day. Why am I going to wear a suit on Shabbat? They're not necessarily wrong, right? Because on one hand, Shabbat, you're supposed to look nice. And I would say, regardless, you should look, looking nice on Shabbat is a good thing, presentable at the very least. But I can understand that argument where it's like, okay, I wear suits all the rest of the days. I'm not going to wear the same kind of suit I would wear on a Wednesday that I would, on Shabbat. I'm not going to wear the same one. So the answer, of course, is to wear a tuxedo. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, but you get what I'm saying. I want to respect everybody's time and stop at this point. We can certainly I can certainly entertain questions during the week or if you have a couple that you want to throw in at the beginning of next week's class, that's fine. But we will turn to prayer from there. And I thank everybody for your attendance and attention.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.